Shalom, 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 everybody. How y'all doing? Welcome back to the next session of Reading with SHILO. I'm SHILO. We up in here. We up in here kind of early tonight, which is good. It's a good time, great time, I think. So we're gonna get it in. We're here to kick off the next session, man. The next session with the next section of On the Real Side by Mr. Mel Watkins. What's up, spiritual conversationalists? How you doing tonight? All right. There we go. We're going to dive in tonight to radio and early television, chapter 17. Not 17, I'm sorry, chapter 7. Chapter 7 of Mr. Mel Watkins' book on the real side, the history of African American comedy from slavery to Chris Rock. So, yeah, we're reading early tonight. I miss Saturday and Sunday. So we're going to get it in tonight. And we're going to pick up where we left off at. Let me get all my stuff out of here and out the way. Right quick. Boom. Everything situated. All right. Let's get it. Come on in. Tell your friend. Tell you can. Get you a paper and pen. You might learn something. All righty. Section 2. It's gonna be about an hour read, 45 minutes to an hour read. Section 2. In 1925, Freeman F. Gosden and Charles J. Correll, an unheralded small-time harmony duo, debuted as musicians on WQGA radio in Chicago. Both had been working as talent show directors for a company that staged amateur shows around the country. They also experimented with a musical routine in which they sang and played piano and the ukulele. Within a year, they have moved to WGN, a station owned by the Chicago Tribune, and according to Arthur Wortham and Correll's son Rich, when management began looking for comedians to create a broadcast adaptation of the comic strip serial The Gumps, Gosden and Correll were approached. They declined the station's idea, but suggested an alternative, black dialect show. At this point, the origin of the character that would become Amos and Andy grows murky. As we have seen, Flower Nora Miller and Aubrey Miles had introduced similar characters after they left Fisk University and began performing in Chicago in the early teens. Shortly after, the pair had incorporated their characters in a musical comedy, The Mayor of Dixie, which was the source of the 1921 Broadway hit Shuffle Along. Even before they left the Broadway, Miller and Lyles had become a popular comedy team in the Chicago area. They performed for Society Sorors as well as the downtown Majestic Theater, and were praised by critics such as Ashton Stevens. Now, in 1925, after their Broadway success, then Shuffle Along and Running Wild in 1923, according to Red Fox and Norma Miller, they were recruited by radio station WGN and the proposed sponsors of a new show to bring their now famous comedy characters to radio. A contract was negotiated by their agent, Harry Bestry. But when the sponsors realized that the comedy team was black and not simply a blackface act, the deal was canceled. Blackface was acceptable, but black skin was not. The official version, however, is that Gosden and Correll suggested the idea to WGN. They had a more exciting idea for a program and presented it to the station. Gosden and Correll wanted to broadcast a serial based on two blacks named Sam and Henry. After some hesitation on the part of station management, their idea was accepted. Sam and Henry debuted on January 12th of 1926. Like the black characters that Octavius Roy Cohen satirized in his Florian Slappy stories, Sammy and Henry were from Birmingham, Alabama. The initial episode depicted them riding on the buckboard of the mule-driven wagon en route to a train depot, where they would take a train to Chicago. When they arrived in Chicago, again, as in Cohen's story, much of the humor revolved around their membership in the Jewels of the Crown, a black fraternal organization. The Black Lodge in Cohen's tales was called Sons and Daughters of I Will Arise. 6 days a week for nearly 2 years, the misadventures of Sam and Henry would be heard on WGN in Chicago. Gosden and Correll's creation of Sam and Henry, their pioneer effort in bringing what amounted to a black situation comedy to radio, would become a hotly disputed topic among blacks in the entertainment world. There is, of course, no doubt that Gosden and Correll absorbed or borrowed much of their material from black acts, and the Miller and Lyles team was probably among them, since they were not only the most prominent and the best known black comics in the Chicago area during the early 20s, but had also written and starred in a hit Broadway musical. It is likely that Gosden and Correll also incorporated material and ideas from the writers like Octavius Roy Cohen, who would later write briefly for the Amos and Andy show, as well as from blackface or minstrel acts such as Matt and Morin, or any of the numerous performers who used burnt cork and Negro dialect at the time. Shalom, shalom. Come on in, welcome. Borrowing from other acts was not a new or unusual occurrence in show business. The song and dance that helped establish Thomas Jim Crow Rice in the 1830s, as we have seen, was borrowed from a crippled black stable hand. Ernest Hogan allegedly acquired his most famous song, All Coons Look Alike to Me, from another musician at the turn of the century. And in the 20s and 30s, many of the Fats Waller's riffs ideas and original compositions, were borrowed or sold for a meal, a few drinks, or less, to various record producers and musicians, including some contend George Gershon and Fletcher Henderson. In any event, jokes cannot be copyrighted. Some comedians' reputations for appropriating others' material reached the level of a standing joke with the industry. Milton Berle, for example, assumed that all jokes were public property and freely borrowed gags and routines from other comedians, prompting Walter Winchell to dub him the thief of bad gags. Pigmeat Merkham said of Berle, I'd only be at the Apollo, or maybe the Alhambra a week for the first time, when this little white cat, hardly out of the knee pants, showed up with his scratch pad and pencil and started copying down every word I said. And during the 30s, Bob Hope and another comedian set up a good-natured practical joke to chide Berle for his alleged penchant. Let's see what that is. Penchant. P-E-N. Penchant. P-E-N-C-H-A-N-T. P-E-N-C-H-A-N-T. Penchant. 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 A strong or habitual liking for something or tendency to do something. He has a penchant for adopting stray dogs. A strong liking for something or tendency to do something, a strong or habitual. Burrow, and during the 30s, Bob Hope and another comedian set up a good natured practical joke to chide Burrow for his alleged habitual liking for stealing gas, his alleged penchant, his alleged penchant for stealing gas. They arrived to appear before Burrell at several benefit shows and perform his entire act before he went on stage. More recently, Richard Pryor, who initially was criticized for emulating Bill Cosby, has admitted, "I did everybody's act for a while. It took me a long time to find my own direction, to stop using other people's stuff." Eddie Murphy, one of the most innovative comedians in the 80s, in turn rehashed some familiar Pryor bits in his early concerts. Later, Martin Lawrence, one of the 90s most popular comics, reprised material from Pryor, Murphy, and Flip Wilson. In comedy, gags, jokes, and routines are regularly exchanged and repeated by various comedians. The originator or inventor is often not as important as the comic who popularizes the routine. And that usually depends on the opportunity. Given the racist climate and black entertainers' limited access to mass media outlets in the mid 20s, there was little chance that Miller and Lyles would have been permitted to star on their own radio show. So Gosling and Carell's presentation of black characters whose prototypes had been brought to the stage years before by minstrels, then refined by black comedians, was not really surprising. It was simply another instance of show business as usual. In some ways, Gosden and Carell were perfectly suited for the task. Charles Carell's family had moved from the South to Peoria, Illinois after the Civil War, and born in 1890, Carell displayed a gift for music and mimicry at an early age. He played piano, danced, sang, and told Negro dialect jokes in amateur minstrel shows before becoming a talent show director. Now, Gosden, oh shit, my bad. Let me get this out of my drink. Gosden, a more persuasive comic actor and Negro impersonator, was born in Richmond, Virginia in 1899. He too demonstrated an early knack for music and comedy. And besides singing and playing an instrument, he dabbled in magic, clog dancing, and had performed as an in-man in amateur minstrel shows. In addition, although the claim that he was raised by a black mammy was a press fabrication, he did have a black childhood friend who worked for his family. He met Garrett Brown, who was nicknamed Snowball, when he was 5, and they often played together, sometimes staging impromptu minstrel shows. Now, Gosden often once claimed that Amos was partly based on his childhood friend, and a few of the phrases that later appeared on the Amos and Andy show, "Ain't that something," for example, were reportedly based on Brown's amusing jargon. Gosden and Carell felt they knew enough about the South and Negro life to write a successful comedy series on blacks. From the outset, the show depended on stereotype caricatures of blacks that had been seen on the minstrel stage for nearly a century. Now, Sam, although sincere and industrious, was superstitious, naive, and easily duped. Henry, on the other hand, was lazy, arrogant, conniving, and drawn to the usual Sambo diversions, crap shooting, womanizing, and liquor. Humor was basically provided by the character's ignorance and the contrast of caricatured minstrel and black Southern folkways with the demands of urban living. But Sam and Henry also reflected the subtle humanizing changes that black performers like Miller and Lyles had instituted into the stage of Negroes. Essentially, What Gosden and Carell added was more emphatic underscoring of voice distinctions. They did nearly 100 separate voice impersonations, and the continuous storyline, attributes necessitated by the demands of the medium. Although it was not an immediate hit, Sam and Henry gradually gained a loyal following. And before Gosden and Carell left WGN, when their 2-year contract expired, their characters had inspired the comic strip and recordings, which were released by Victor. Now, on March 19th of 1928, almost 3 months after the last Sam and Henry show, Amos and Andy debuted on WMAQ, a rival station in Chicago. And due to legal entanglements, the characters had been renamed, but Sam Gosden and Henry Carell were virtually unaltered when they resurfaced as Amos and Andy and Andrew H. Brown. And the show was even more successful. Recorded and leased by 40 other stations, it was an immediate hit in Chicago and well as other parts of the country. Network executives took notice, and in August of 1929, the Pepsodent toothpaste as sponsor, the show switched to NBC. Immediately, its popularity soared, and by 1930, it had become a nationwide rage. And until 1943, it was broadcast nightly as a 15-minute serial. If Sam and Henry had been radio's first situation comedy, Amos and Andy was the great radio show. Many maintain that, at its peak, it may have been the most popular show ever broadcast, and it also represented the most widespread dissemination of public black humor until its time. It was, in fact, a comic black voice soap opera that, like minstrelsy, allowed America obliquely to scrutinize and laugh at its own problems. Gosden and Carell spotlighted two Georgia Negroes whose migration first to Chicago and then to Harlem humorously mirrored the plight of the nation's common man, caught in the transformation from the agrarian society to a complex urban one. So from the farm life to city life. The comic currency remained thick dialect speech, malapropism, and the standard Negro stereotypes, naivety, imprudence, venality, and ignorance. But the show's enduring success probably rested as much on Gosden and Carell's creation as a dramatic setting that typically reflected non-racial issues and embodied the concerns of a larger segment of society. Unlike minstrelsy, in which the foolish antics of the Inman, Tambo, and Bones were continually contrasted with the staid, often pompous interlocutor. There we go. My bad. Unlike minstrelsy, in which the fool antics of the Inman, Tambo, and Bones were continually contrasted with the staid, often pompous interlocutor representing proper mainstream values. The creators in Amos and Andy functioned in an entirely black setting where their behavior was not continually contrasted with the norms of the larger society. The difference is instantly apparent when the radio show is compared with motion pictures, such as A Check and Double Check, where Amos and Andy were placed in an integrated setting and played against straight mainstream characters, whereas Tambo and Bones were portrayed as unassimilable fools whose feral antics and uncured instincts placed them behind the bonds of an even marginally polite society. Amos and Andy were presented as bona fide Americans, albeit second class ones, struggling to open up their own business, a taxi service, and secure a place in a rapidly changing society that, in limited manner, was realistically presented. Less than a year after the show debuted on NBC, as the country grappled with the stock market crash, Andy attempted to explain the financial crisis in Litman, a minor character who was seeking a job with the Fresh Air Taxi Company. Well, Lightning, of course, I would like to give you a job, but this business requisition is on right now. Andy said. When Lightning asked if anybody got hurt in the crash, Andy continued, well, of course, Lightning, when the stock market crashes, it hurts us businessmen. That's what puts the requisition on things. A few days later, Andy and George Stevens, Kingfish, offered a comically inspired explanation for the market atrocities. Let me see, not atrocities, my bad. For the market intricacies. I know what that is. You see, Kingfish asserted a week ago, Thursday, the big crash started. The bulls on the bears was fighting it out, and the bears chased the bulls. The plight of the small investor and the value of inside tips were also discussed. Everybody got a tip, Kingfish pontificated. Everybody knows the inside on the stocks, you see? That's what they tell you. So then you buy it and it just look like they waiting for you to buy it. Because the minute you buy, it goes down. This kind of folksy interpretation of the repression and other social issues helped inform laymen and immensely broadened the show's popularity. Throughout the 30s and into the early 40s, the combination topical themes, a serial format, and folksy dialect humor kept Amos and Andy among the most popular radio programs on the air. In fact, during its peak years in the early 30s, the program seemed to have created a kind of national frenzy. Like popular movie serials in the 30s and the 40s and today's television soap operas. Episodes dovetailed and crucial dramatic situations were frequently left unresolved from one broadcast to the next. A sequence aired on October 1931, for example, had Amos falsely accused of murder and brought to trial. The trial went on for several episodes, and when it seemed that he was about to be convicted, listeners were outraged. The president of the advertising firm representing Pepsodent warned Gosden and Corral. The country's mad. The Parent Teacher Association is going to boycott the program of Amos if Amos is convicted. One commentator contends that no trial in fact or fiction ever interested the people more. On another occasion, in 1939, a series of programs focused on Amos' impending marriage. At the wedding, however, before Andy could utter the final I do, a shot was heard and Andy collapsed. The next day, controversy erupted in the press. Lawyers jumped into the fray, bickering over fine points of law. Attorneys citing statutes from various states offered contradictory assessments of Andy's marital status, and Time magazine collected opinions from jurists in New York City, Iowa, and California. When the ballyhoo abated, it was discovered that no one had been shot. The wedding was called off. Andy remained single and continued his philandering ways. My bad. Amos and Andy was the number one show in the country and, from all reports, was nearly addictive. Newspapers had often carried accounts of the previous night's developments. Listeners discussed the characters' problems as if they were real-life events. The daily routines of a group of ersatz black folks had never received such exposure and scrutiny in the national media. The phenomenon would not be repeated until the debut of the Bill Cosby's more realistic but ironically less representative television chronicle of the Huxtables in the 80s. By 1935, 70% of American homes had radios, and according to some estimates, 40 million listeners were tuned in to the program each night. No matter what movie house you attended, Ube Blake recalled, the show would come to a sudden stop at 7 o'clock, and loudspeakers would bring to the audience the 15-minute Amos and Andy show. During the 1932 presidential campaign, radio spots had to be scheduled so that they did not compete with Amos and Andy. Woo-woo. Amos and Andy was doing their thing. The president can't even get on because Amos and Andy coming on. Damn. A large part of the American people, some complained, are more interested in the kingfish and the fresh air taxi cab than they are the affairs of their own country. Other claims that telephone calls diminished after 7 p.m. to 7:15 p.m., and the use of the utilities decreased. Bus lines and taxis had no passengers. If records can be believed, people did not run water or flush toilets at Amos and Andy's time. Whew. Atlantic City shopkeepers found it necessary to install loudspeakers at street corners so the tourists wouldn't have to stay in their hotel rooms to keep up with kingfish. One newspaper suggested that the show was changing the nation's speech patterns. Throughout the country, jokes, gags, the characters' favorite sayings, ain't that something? Explain that to me. Or holy mackerel were rehashed and repeated the next day. The audience varied from the poor and middle class to celebrities and the nation's wealthiest class, from middle bros to high bros. Avid fans included J. Edgar Hoover, Herbert Hoover, Vincent Astor, Henry Ford, Huey Long, who would appropriate George Stevens' name, the Kingfish, and the British playwright George Bernard Shaw, who submitted that there are three things which I shall never forget about America: the Rocky Mountains, Niagara Falls, and Amos and Andy. Although the original comic, 15-minute soap opera approach also was basically unaltered until 1943, subtle changes in emphasis were made along the way. At the outset, most episodes revolved around the close friendship and extreme contrast between Amos, loyal, diligent, but slow, and Andy, improvident, scheming, and idle. Gosden and Carell were essentially presenting two stock black stage characters, but they had added a slight twist. They moderated their main characters, giving them a veil of propriety that partially obscured the patently mean or fatuous traits that had previously defined these comic types. Amos was neither as dense and gullible as the prototypical stage or screen Sambo portrayed by Aubrey Lyles or Charlie Mack, nor as much the quintessential darky as portrayed by Bert Williams. Although Amos was often duped by Andy's dim-witted schemes and was inevitably the straight man in their comic exchanges, in contrast to Andy's trickster image, he projected on mainstream, almost bourgeois sensibility. And although Andy was cast in the familiar image of the conniving stage dandy, he seldom displays the rapturous venality and male violence that quite often define this type. The moderation with much Amos and Andy was initially portrayed probably accounts for their huge following. Let me read that again. The moderation with which Amos and Andy were initially portrayed probably accounts for their huge following. That sounds better. Amos, after all, was such a beloved and trustworthy character that he became a national symbol and thrift and responsibility during the Depression. One newspaper editor cited him as a model of a sensible response to the nation's economic woes and suggested that there were too many Andy Brown types. As the media historian Arthur Wortham pointed out, through Amos, Gosden, and Carell reasserted the values of generosity, diligence, and unpretentiousness, morals that many Americans wanted to, I guess it's supposed to be morals that many Americans wanted to return to at the time. And while the prodigal ways and aversions to work were chastened, Andy never moved beyond the point where audiences could react with amused affection. He was a gentle, almost childlike trickster, and listeners responded with overwhelming concern and empathy when he was apparently shot at his wedding and when he was sued by Madame Queen for breach of promise. Generally, then Amos and Andy were laughed with, not at. Listeners identified with them, and a columnist could write without intentional irony in the choice of the word shades. The average radio listener recognizes in the day-to-day affairs of Amos and Andy shades of his own triumphs and defeats, joys and sorrows, reactions and reasonings. Responsibilities for the bulk of the program's humor was left to the supporting cast. Not coincidentally, their roles embodied nearly all of the derisively humorous attributes of minstrel caricature. Freeman Gosden was far and away his partners. Freeman Gosden was far and away his partner's superior as the black mimic. That don't sound right. Freeman Gosden was far and away his partner's superior as a black mimic. Therefore, he assumed the voices of most of the most prominent comic characters, Lightning and George Kingfish Stevens. Lightning was Sambo without palliation, while Amos's earnestness, industriousness, and common sense compensated for his naivety and ignorance. The slothful, simple-minded Lightning was a one-dimensional character who mirrored the image projected by Molasses in January and Stephen Fetching. Now, Kingfish was an unscrupulous, conniving dandy who seldom displayed the thoughtfulness or self-appraisal that often tempered Andy's scheming, rankish nature. As the program evolved, Kingfish and Lightning would gradually assume more and more comic importance. When the nation's economy strengthened, or at least slowed its downward spiral, the show's emphasis switched from plots centered on the financial problems of Andy and the hardworking Amos to focus more on scams perpetuated by Kingfish, the exalted ruler of the mystic knights of the sea, whose first appeared on the show Catfish and the Shad. Audiences apparently tiring of Amos's quiet sincerity, thirsted for more comic attention, and with his indefatigable. I don't think I'm pronouncing it right. INDEFIG. Oh, my bad. Let me erase that. INDEFATIGABLE. 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 Oh, I'm saying that shit wrong. INDEFAT.
Indefatigable.
I'm saying it correct. Indefatigable. All right. Thank you, Teresa. Indefatigable. Uh, of a person or their efforts, persisting tirelessly. Indefatigable. Indefatigable. Thirsted for more comic action, and with his persisting or indefatigable pursuit of easy money, Kingfish supplied it. Amos was gradually reduced to walk-ons, in which he attempted to steer Andy away from Kingfish's absurd schemes. I lost my place, my bad. Kingfish supplied it. Amos was gradually reduced to walk-ons, in which he attempted to steer Andy away from Kingfish's absurd schemes, which included selling motorless cars or deeds to the Washington Monument and the Brooklyn Bridge. But as the comedy was heightened by Kingfish's broad, exaggerated ethnic humor, and Amos was phased out of the central action, Amos and Andy lost some of its realistic drama appeal and moved closer to familiar minstrel stereotypes and blackface burlesque. Initially, the changes were effective and slumping ratings were revitalized. But the early 40s, however, radio comedy itself had undergone broad changes in the process of radically influencing America's popular entertainment. Encouraged by the success of Gosden and Carell and Will Rogers, who appeared on the host of a variety shows beginning in the 20s and whose monologues were featured weekly on The Golf Show from 1933 until his death of 1935. A number of talented vaudeville performers began testing the radio market. Recognizing its appeal and potential, well-known stage comedians who had initially spurned the new medium began rushing in to capitalize on what was perceived by the 30s as a lucrative and comparatively undemanding market. Now, Eddie Cantor, Ed Wine, Fred Allen, Jack Benny, and George Burns and Gracie Allen had begun radio series by the early 30s. A decade later, W.C. Fields, Fanny Brice, Bob Hope, and Red Skellington, among others, had joined them. Radio networks had modernized their broadcast methods, so comedians were no longer forced to work within the audience in deathly silence and cramped studios. Increasingly, vaudeville clowns who had molded their routines for live shows and the rigid censorship exercised on the Keith and Orpheum circuits, where salacious material with diligently exercised, were finding that their acts were perfectly suited for the medium seeking innocuous humor and family-oriented entertainment. Consequently, radio was invaded by a host of slick vaudevillians who came equipped with bands, announcers with charisma, and studio audiences that laughed out loud over the air. This new breed of radio comedian, many of whom flaunted years of experience in movies as well as on the stage, also came with the behind the scenes brigade, a corps of writers and pundits who supplied endless new gags for a medium whose weekly regimen voraciously devoured ideas. By the late 30s, the slow pace, basically sentimental Amos and Andy show was outmatched by their sophisticated new comedy programs. Pepsodent abandoned the program in 1937 and began sponsoring Bob Hope's show for the following year. Gosden and Carell, who still wrote the scripts and portrayed nearly all of the characters themselves, realized that change was necessary. Early in 1943, The familiar 15-minute format was dropped, and in October, a thoroughly revamped half-hour version of Amos and Andy returned to the air. The show was performed before a live audience and featured Jeff Alexander's orchestra and chorus. Harlow Wilcox, a lively announcer who established a reputation on the Fibber McGee and Molly show, and new supporting characters portrayed by such performers as Eddie Green, Lou Lubin, Harriet Widmer, Ernestine Wade, and Amanda Randolph. Additional writers were employed. Celebrity guests appeared, and each show focused on a single comic situation. This new, slicker version of Amos and Andy, although it lost much of the intimacy of the original, was well received. Again, the show climbed in ratings and, for a time, was among radio's top 10 programs. Although it never regained the fanatical following of the 30s, the new Amos and Andy did represent a breakthrough. For the first time, it moved away from strict adherence to the concept of verbal minstrelsy and introduced Black performers. Veteran TOBA comedian Eddie Green, who starred in several race films in the 30s and 40s and had a supporting part as a comic waiter on the Duffy's Tavern radio show in 1941 to 1951, was cast as the lawyer, Stonewall. Amanda Randolph, another featured player in the Black cast movie, who co-starred with Green in Sepia Arts, Comes Midnight in 1940, played Kingfish's ever-menacing mother-in-law. Ernestine Wade's portrayal of the now infamous Sapphire, Kingfish's shrill, domineering wife, had more impact than any of the parts assigned to Blacks. Her unerring performance was so indelible that her character became synonymous with caricatures of the castigating and cantankerous Black female. To this day, the name Sapphire defines the stereotype. Wade, Amanda, Randolph, Johnny Lee, who joined the cast later, and Lillian Randolph, who had replaced the white actress Harriet Widmer as Madame Queen, were the only performers who would work or make the transition from radio to television. Now, James Baskett, who was a favorite of the Apollo Theater and would later star as this Uncle Remus in the Disney Song of the South in 1946, also appeared on the radio show. Overshadowing the emergence of the Black performers on the show was the expanded role assigned to Kingfish. With the new format, he virtually dominated the action. In the early 50s, when I listened to the program as a child, audiences wondered why it was called Amos and Andy. Amos seldom appeared, and most plots centered either on Kingfish's abortive attempts to bamboozle Andy and Lightning or his domestic misadventures with Sapphire and her mother. Although it was no longer the national rage it once had been and had shed much of its homely mainstream morality, in my working class Black neighborhood, the program was still must listening on Friday nights. In these later shows, the slick, fast-talking Kingfish set the pace, and the program depended almost entirely on his trickster ploys for its humor and appeal. The following exchange illustrates Kingfish's instant indolence and the source of his friction with Sapphire, as well as a general nature of the show's humor. Sapphire. George Stevens. I done made up my mind that I'm going to have a husband that dresses good, knows nice people, and has got a steady job. Kingfish. Sapphire, you mean to say that you was going to leave me? Sapphire. George, I know why you're a no-good bum. It's on account of your association with Andy Brown. Why don't you try to meet a nicer class of men? Kingfish. Well, I ain't got the opportunity to meet them. They're all working. Sapphire. Well, that Andy Brown is the cause of it all. What was he ever accomplished? Kingfish. Well, yesterday he had a run of 13 balls in the side pocket without leaning on the table. Sapphire. Now, that's exactly what I mean. Andy hanging around the pool table all day. Why don't he go to a cultured place like a public library? Kingfish. They ain't got no pool table there. Kingfish, through the voice of Freeman Gosden, would emerge as one of the electronic media's more memorable and outlandish rogues. For many people, he would become, along with Sapphire, one of the most recognizable opprobrious, let's see if that's right, opprobrious, OPPROBIBRRO, I'm gonna spell it again, BRIOUS, OPPROBRIOUS. I think it's opprobrious. 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 Here's APPROBR. There we go. Opprobrious. Opprobrious of language expressing scorn or criticism. His opprobrious remarks. One of the most recognizable Black characters who express scorn and criticism. Opprobrious, one of the most recognizable, opprobrious Black characters in the history of radio and later television. Gosden and Carell abandoned the familiar radio rendering of Amos and Andy in 1954, and for the next 6 years hosted a sanitized version of the program, the Amos and Andy Music Hall, on which they played records and presented brief comic skits. That show was canceled on November 25th of 1960, except for bootleg films, which were readily available and later videotapes the original Amos and Andy characters, clearly embarrassments for most middle-class Blacks, had been banished from earshot and public view. And that was section 2. We're done. That was section 2 of chapter 7. Let me see. Yeah. 1, 2, 3, 4 pages. I should just go ahead on and read section 3. That's what I should do. But I'm gonna stop there. Yes, I think that was a good 45 minutes. A good 45 minutes of reading. We'll stop there. We'll come back next time with section 3. Section 3, we'll probably read, let me see, section 3 and section 4. Because section 3 is only 4 pages. Let me see, 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, I'll come back the next time. I'll come back and read section 3 and section 4. It'll be about a total 8 pages. 8 pages front and back, so 16 pages. 16 pages, and we're almost to chapter 8. We will almost be to chapter 8. So yeah, they're getting into some more of my time frame now. I remember Amos and Andy, but I don't remember watching the show. I remember hearing about it. It is, I think it was a problem for them back then. When Amos and Andy was had everybody stopping what they was doing. It almost seemed like when Martin came on, or TGIF, when TGIF first started, I think that's how it was. Like when Fresh Prince came on, these are the things that everybody would talk about, and now you have people who are even on YouTube and they're watching shows and they're having the discussions and putting so much into the lives of the characters of these people, and they're examining the lives of the characters and the all the different situations. They're trying to find what they call Easter eggs that show little things from other areas in the shows. I don't know if anything's as big as what they say the Amos and Andy show was, but man, to be the one of the favorites. First, you had blackface in the White House being performed in the White House. Then you got Amos and Andy damn near taking control of the whole nation. It just goes to show once again the power of the influential ideas of the so-called blacks in America. You know, the things that we have to offer that really we never get paid for. You think about, you can think about how much the Amos and Andy probably got people through, the depression times. If there was another depression, what would happen? What would be used to help people be able to fight off the thoughts that they may be having about the depression, the thoughts of losing their jobs, having to feed their families and they can't feed their families, but all they got is a radio that they can listen to. And we're going to crowd around this radio, every night for 15 minutes, listen to Amos and Andy just to break away from the maybe what they may consider their hellish lives at the time. So but it's very interesting to see. I would say you can definitely with that you can definitely tell with these times you can definitely tell how the fads, as you would call them, I guess the fads were created, propagated by the different media sources, whether it be radio or television, so that way the so-called white folks can make the money like they still doing today. But at the same time, they're upset because of the popularity that these things gain, to where everybody wants to be and do these things. At one point, they were talking about how all the white people was trying to dance the jig and do the turkey shuffles and the nigger dances and sing the nigger songs. And up until this point with Amos and Andy, now they're watching and listening to the nigger shows, the nigger movies, the colored movies, shit, paying their money to go see them in the vaudevilles and the variety shows. I think we still have the same thing. It's only just a revised. It seemed like a lot of it is the same. It's just a revised idea of it, or a revised thing. And for people who like me, I wouldn't have known a lot of this because but for the people who read and can see the different things, they'll be able to see the continuation of these different minstrel shows or acts, or the same way that they said that comedians were pulling each other gags and jokes and stuff like that. You could see the same thing going on today, as it is a reemergence of everything. They say what goes around comes around, and it definitely seems like history is repeating itself in a lot of different areas. Uh, Music, television style. What's the next big thing? I think right now is the AI or whatever. But hey, who knows? Who knows if these things will keep going? Will keep going like they're going, but definitely good history. We are almost to the middle of the book. Look at that, man. We almost halfway through that thing. Yeah, halfway through that thing. I think once we reach chapter 8, we will be halfway through the book. Halfway through the book. Man. And chapter 8 is next. This chapter has my 6. So far, 6. Excuse me. I'm glad I read early. Ooh, that last section is long. Ooh, wee. For sure. Did you delete that comment, and what was it? I would like to know if you deleted it, or did she delete that herself? Well, I'll trust your judgment. All right, yeah, I'll trust your judgment. So yeah, for those who come back later on, and check it out, man, leave a comment about the things that you have heard. Leave a comment about some of the things you think. Some ideas you may have about maybe some stuff I'm missing. I can. Oh shit, my bad. I can remember the Amos and Andy, and I think I pulled it up the other night on Tubi or something like that. I think it's still available to watch. So some of these old shows, some of these old minstrels, if you can find them, if you can, maybe get YouTube copies of them, whatever, man, they'll be good things to have, good things to look at, so you can have a visual example of what it could have been like back in them days. Yes, you may laugh at them, but also remember the things that they had to go through to even make you laugh, to even have the position, the ability to make you laugh. You know, they were still treated like dogs. They were still treated like dogs, but they did, in a sense, they sold their soul to the devil to try to get themselves, or to try to put future people in a better position. They made it easier. These are the forerunners of the black comedians, or the so-called black comedians. And they was doing big things. It was doing big things. So, but it's good to know. Good to know. Definitely great achievements to continue to add to the long list of achievements that so-called blacks have had and have made here in America since the time of slavery. And even before slavery. It's still good stuff, man. Good stuff. Good stuff. Still waiting for the funny though. I'm still waiting for the funny. I wanna laugh like my side hurting funny. Maybe it might not be in here, but we'll keep pushing to see. One word at a time, one page at a time, one section at a time, one chapter at a time until we finish the book, man. Until we finish the book and move on to the next. Lord willing. Lord willing. But that's it for reading with SHILO tonight, man. I hope that y'all enjoyed it. Till next time, appreciate you, spiritual conversationalists. Thanks for the moderation. Good job. Keep it up. Keep it up. The bigger we grow, you might have to have a job. Might need you as an employee. So yeah. But shalom. Till next time. Shalom, everybody. SHILO out. SHILO out.